When I was in 7th grade, there was a new guy that came in called Adam. We were very good friends as he was with basically everyone. He was extremely charismatic, had amazing drawing skills with a very particular cartoony weird art style, and he wasn't edgy per se, but was one of those, screw religion kind of people. We played a lot of Xbox together, and the absolute only games he played were shooters. Black, Halo, Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, and Sniper Elite were his entire game roster. His dad was from Belgium, and they had a few weapons. In 10th grade I moved schools to one closer to my house, but my best friends, 1 guy, 3 girls, all stayed behind. So did my now wife, but we weren't dating at that time. So I stayed in touch with most of the people from that school. The principal that we had was famed for being really hard before she got to that school, and her arrival wasn't exactly welcome with open arms, but everyone put up with it in the end. There was a point in which Adam started handing out bullets or bullet casings to people he deemed important, and he gave these to my best friends, all 4 of them, and to my wife, which was his girlfriend for the past year or so. He also had a habit of making cuts in his forearms and sucking his own blood, and he kept preaching that Thursday was going to be the day. This kept happening for like a week, until said Thursday when he went into the principal's office and spoke to her for about 5 minutes and then put a bullet in her skull. He then ran to a nearby field where he had his backpack, where he was allegedly planning on taking his own life but wasn't able to do it. So he went back to the front of the school and just sat there until the police came for him. This was the first fatal shooting in my country, and it was talked about for quite a while. She died a week and a half later, and he was sentenced to 10 years. It freaked me out when my mother mentioned that I was lucky I wasn't in the school anymore, since it was discussed that he held a big resentment towards me because I started dating his ex-girlfriend, my now wife. I never knew if this was true or not, but it makes me wonder. This happened when I was a freshman in high school in 2001. A few weeks after, another school a few miles away had a deadly shooting. No one died, but it's still stuck in my memory. It was 5th period, which is right after lunch, and I was sitting in my geography class, which was actually located in a small room inside of the library because of overcrowding. Class had just started when the intercom came on, and the principal's voice was shaking and yelled that this was a lockdown situation and not a drill. I could hear the commotion in the background. Everyone freaked out. We were really confused because how could something happen in our school when a shooting had just happened at our neighborhood school a month before? My teacher ran over and locked the door. The room didn't have any windows to the outside, just that one that looked into the library, since we were in a room within a room. He just kept telling us to stay calm, and we kept asking what was happening, but he didn't know any more than we did. Some time passed and we heard helicopters above, but nothing else. Some kids were freaking out and crying. Others were trying to distract themselves, but mostly everyone was sitting in their desk or on the floor silently. I sat on the floor and kept looking at the door, imagining someone busting through and killing me. I kept thinking that I didn't want to die, but I was convinced I was going to. Since I was in the library, I kept thinking about Columbine, and I thought I would be the first target. I've never felt fear like that before. A while after, my teacher went through a side door to the librarian's office. We could hear that a TV or radio was on, and I think they were watching or listening to news coverage on what was happening. Then he came back in, and we asked what was happening, but he couldn't tell us. He told us to stay calm and put on the Karate Kid. I was pissed, but in retrospect I understand why he didn't tell us. An hour or so went by. My teacher either got a phone call or through the intercom and told us that we were safe and the SWAT team would be coming through to clear out rooms and escort us out safely. He said to drop all our things and stand with our hands on top of our heads, and we did. And then the door opened and a SWAT officer was pointing a rifle at us and a line of other officers doing the same behind him. They entered the room, looked and searched around and ordered us to walk out in single file with our hands on our heads. We did, and I walked out crying. I smiled at an officer and said thank you, and he nodded and winked. They escorted us to a park across the street where our parents were waiting. Since only a few kids had cell phones, we had to just wander around until we found them. As I was sobbing and looking for my parents, there were news reporters and cameras approaching me and the other kids, asking us questions. I ignored them, but I'm still disgusted by that. I should have punched them. It should be illegal to approach children for interviews after stuff like this. I found my parents and they started sobbing, and they explained what happened as they drove me home, as they're both cops. It turned out that a kid had brought in a shotgun and shot at the administration office window and at the student and teachers around it. Luckily, there was a police officer on campus at the time because of the shooting at the other school. He wasted no time in neutralizing the shooter, who was taken into custody, and it happened all in the span of a few minutes. Nobody perished, 5 people were injured but none seriously, and when I got home I turned on the TV, and they had identified the shooter. It was a senior I had sat next to in a class the entire semester before. We worked on projects together. He was definitely an outcast and I thought he was kind of weird, but I never thought he would do something like that. I spoke to him a fair amount in class. Now he did have a tendency to get very ticked off over small things, like if he did badly on a test or someone said something he didn't like, instead of dropping it, he'd curse and throw down his pencil and act like it was the end of the world and not speak to anyone. Sometimes he would come to class and just look super pissed off and not talk all day. Other days he was really nice and we'd strike up conversations. Looking back, I think he might have had a crush on me. I remember one time I corrected his test and signed my name at the bottom, and I always dotted my I's with hearts, and he asked, "Is that heart for me?" And I laughed and said no. He didn't talk to me for the rest of the class. He ended up taking his own life in jail before his trial ended. It came out that he had been abused his whole life and had just been rejected from the military before he committed the shooting. I had nightmares for years about him taking his life, and I wonder if there was something I could have said or done to help him, to prevent him doing what he did. I also wonder if he would have come to my class. Would he have taken my life or spared me? A lot of people immediately hated him and wished a cop would have taken him out completely instead of just wounding him. But I don't. I wish he would have had a better life, or at least served time and found peace and became a better person. I know he wasn't evil. There was good inside him. He just needed help, but never got any. Back when I was in my first year, I was sitting in maths class, third to last period of the day. It was double art or DT or some really easy subject, on a nice warm March day about 15 minutes into the class, when we hear a bang. We're jolted out of our math-induced comas by this sound. The classroom was situated at the top of this old staircase which amplified the sound, which also happened to have emanated from just the bottom of the staircase in the adjacent hallway. The teacher told us to stay in our seats and walked to the next classroom to find out what was going on. It was then announced over the intercom that all students were to remain in their classes for the rest of the day, around another 90 minutes or so. We spent the rest of the day up there doing our homework and speculating what the sound had been. When the end of the day came, we were escorted to the buses. Usually we could walk down unattended on long detours around the school, where we would normally have made the journey in 30 seconds, this one took 2 minutes. The first sign of trouble was seeing 3 marked police cars in the front of the school. The second sign was seeing 2 officers with MP5 submachine guns standing by one of the main student entrances. The third and final, and most damning sign of trouble, was the fact that of the 4 large plain glass windows to some of the front-facing classes, 2 had shattered completely. On the bus home, further speculations suggested it had been a bomb. Others said it was a massive firework of some kind, and some of my friends had been closer to the source of the explosion and said one of the teachers had a breakdown later on. The next day the windows had been repaired, but the area of the school was still damaged. There had been lockers beside a small set of stairs and double doors in front of the steps. The doors were splintered, and the lockers were no longer there. It eventually emerged that the source of the explosion had been quite a large firework, which the school seniors had fashioned a time delay fuse, somehow using cigarettes or something to detonate it when no one would be in the vicinity. I actually had forgotten about this incident until recently. I was with my mum and dad about to go shopping for Christmas gifts. My parents parked the car, and as we get out, this guy was lighting up a cigarette and stops us and says, "Hey, there are 2 people over there with guns drawn. I'd get back in your car and shop somewhere else." We left, got dinner, and saw lots of emergency vehicles that night. The next morning there was an article about the parking lot shooting at the Target we were at. I can't remember, but a few people died. When this happened, I was sad I didn't get to go to Target, but now I really understand the situation. I feel so bad for the people and families who were affected by it. I'm hoping the guy who warned us that there were guns out is doing okay and living a great life. This happened about 16 years ago. I didn't know the victim personally. He was a bit of a loner, and he came into my high school and shot himself midday. A lot of people who had been out on the soccer field witnessed it. Immediately after, we were terrified. I went to a very large school, and we practiced lockdown drills all the time, several times a month at least. We went into lockdown. They refused to tell us what was going on, and our phones didn't really help much because it was too early for the news stations to make any reports yet. We thought there was someone going on a shooting spree in the school. Turns out everyone else found out what was going on before we did, and we were locked in that same classroom for hours. My mum picked me up later that day crying. The news had reported someone had been shot, but they weren't sure who it was, and I'm not sure my parents knew that someone just took their own life. There were ambulances and police cars covering the parking lot, and news helicopters flying overhead. We had a few days off school and eventually returned. They had blocked off the patio outside, where he had done the deed. It was kind of connected to the cafeteria, and the cafeteria had big floor-to-ceiling windows, so you could see where the blood stains would have been on the cement, even though they had washed it all away. It was a very somber atmosphere. Lots of crying, lots of rumors. Some people said he had a bunch of magazines in his backpack ready to shoot up the school. Some people say they saw him drop to the ground. It was very eye-opening. We had school assemblies and grief counselors on the premises, and they became very much stricter and safety-wise, and started bringing police dogs out more often to snip around the parking lot for any evidence of gunpowder. Things got back to normal, but it really put things into perspective. I didn't know the guy, but this dude had friends and family, and people can be really good at hiding things. Be careful what you say and do to people, and don't be afraid to offer someone support or just a hug or an ear. Who knows who's out there, suffering, depressed, and just needs a friend, and what might happen if they don't receive the help they need. I was a sergeant in the US Army, and getting out of the military when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq in 2003. I had just returned home to Austin, Texas, when I was summoned into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry, and told I was being recalled to the Army, but the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I was not part of the unit yet, so the commander ordered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton, in Houston. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I took the offer. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team overseeing logistics affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy of supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with IEDs, small arms skirmishes, and almost continual breakdowns of both army and civilian vehicles. Because I was an SAW gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while in active duty, I was technically still in the Guard. I was often in the convoys manning a mounted weapon that accompanied the mostly civilian convoy, and during these runs we had a few strange encounters in an area south of Baghdad known as Camp Babylon, occupied by French troops but then designated an archaeological site for obvious reasons. Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to be originally inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure once stood at the spot. I had two strange incidents happen to me while passing through there. The first seemed a bit benign, but set the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the top, standing operation procedure, was to stop the convoy and return fire. This was because in the past, such incidences ending up being a lone gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into an IED on the road. Because of this, the standard operation procedure changed to stop the convoy, dismount and return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices on the road, we scanned the horizon for the enemy. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadowy figures that seemed to move around the area. Several times we would spot the figures, but they would immediately disappear. A contractor lying beside me with his weapon commented, "How odd that we're in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural." I didn't respond, but knew he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon. I didn't feel at the time that much was supernatural, but certainly did see the shadowy and bizarrely small figures dart around the structure. Once the road was deemed clear, we continued on to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed the supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon, while the army mechanics took a look at the vehicle, and the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area. Strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used night vision goggles to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving towards a set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forwards away from the convoy to see what the source was. After seeing it was self-contained and not a person, we were a bit alarmed. Then we heard a sound that I will never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures and foundations not far away. It sounded like a woman in agony mixed with loneliness. On and on the sound went, while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to with our night vision goggles equipped. We used our flashlights to spot the ruins. If you've ever done this, you'll know that a normal flashlight with night vision goggles looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the area but found no source to the wails nor the ball of light. Around this time we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was slinging my SAW over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp, and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning, several of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily operations briefing. It was then I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor, so I asked him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that as we were leaving our position on the sandy hill, he saw a tall, black figure standing beside the ruins. It was watching us as we were looking for them. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him and thought he was going to die. He didn't remember leaving the area. His next memory was in the Humvee heading back to Kuwait. I now write non-fiction books about the haunted places for Llewellyn Publishing and have visited hundreds of reputedly haunted spots, but I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha and Camp Arif Jan, they were horrified. One of them, a translator we called Ardi, said that we had encountered a jinn, or a damned spirit, and that we were lucky to be able to tell the tale, and I agreed. I'm a former Brazilian Marine with 8 years of active duty under the belt, and I'd like to report a well-known story among the Marines about the disappearance of a sergeant on an island where we usually conducted military training exercises once a year, known as Ilha de Marambaia. Marambaya Island is an island that during the time when Brazil was still an empire was a refuge of slaves who fled the farms and gathered in communities in the most isolated parts of the island. These people were known as quilombolas, and to this day they still survive and thrive on the island through hunting and fishing. At one of these military trainings that take place every year, a newly graduated sergeant, I think his name was Ricardo, made friends with one of the locals who lived there, which is very rare to happen, as we're advised to avoid all contact with them as they can be hostile. During some conversations with them, he told Sergeant Ricardo an ancient story of an old treasure hidden inside a cave in one of the isolated areas of the island. The old treasure was hidden there by a group of thieves who shipwrecked on the island many years during the time when Brazil was still an empire. However, he told the sergeant that he should not enter the cave because any quilombola that had already entered to try and retrieve it was never seen or heard from again. So it was known to be inhabited by a spirit who viciously protected the treasure from outsiders. Ricardo was skeptical and did not believe in such spirits. He asked to show him where the cave was, and the guy refused to show the cave entrance because he said it was dangerous. Ricardo then did not insist and decided to forget about the story and just focus on the military training. Years passed, but Ricardo never forgot the story of the treasure on the island, and he was thinking about how his life would change if he could be the one to find it. The life of a Marine in Brazil was very rough, and the salary low. He dreamed of getting out of the Marines one day and starting his own business, and the treasure could help with that. So he decided that the next time he went to attend a military training on the island, he would insist that his friend show him where the cave entrance was, even if he had to offer money for them to show the way. After a few months, Sergeant Ricardo became aware that he would be chosen to be part of the next training on the island, and that would be his chance to change his life forever. Arriving on the island, he attended the usual training drills and waited until the day off, which was one of the days where there would be no training and he would have enough time to hopefully explore the cave. He waited for dawn to go to the Quilombola cave without anyone from his squad seeing him, since the exploration of the island by the military was prohibited by the officers, as there have been cases of military personnel vanishing in previous trainings, and then he asked one of his mates to show him the way to the cave. Before he went, Ricardo invited a close friend to go with him to help find the treasure. This close friend is the person who spread the story that you are now hearing, and said that if they found it, they would share. The sergeant's friend refused to go because he said it was dangerous and advised him not to go either. He ignored his friend's advice and decided to go anyway. After finding one of them and insisting that they show him the way, he agreed and took Ricardo to the entrance of the cave where the sergeant entered in search of the life-changing treasure. The next day, the sergeant's friend noticed that he had never returned from his search in the cave and told the officer what happened. Search teams were requested, and it took about a week to find the entrance to the cave where the sergeant entered. After conducting searches inside the cave, they found Sergeant Ricardo's dead body. What's more likely is that he was lost inside and couldn't find the exit, or was bitten by a snake. Heavy rain on the island was very common, and snakes tend to take refuge in caves. It's said that the Marine Corps compensated the sergeant's family and hid the case from the public so that it didn't appear in the newspapers. I don't know if that really happened or not, but it's a very common story in the Marine Corps that's often told by older Marines. It's said that this story happened in the early 1990s, so it was probably no big deal to hide it from the media at the time. This was in April of 2018. I had gone to Colorado for a concert and was just driving around checking everything out before and after. The day before the concert, I was driving through the Rockies because I thought it'd be cool. It was already past 9 PM at this point, and I get to a gas station and there's an old lady with a giant suitcase. I went inside, bought a pack of swishers, got gas, and as I went to leave she asked me for a ride. Being young and stupid, I said, "Sure, hop in." Then She had me get her giant suitcase in the backseat and we were off. The ride started off pretty normal at first. We spoke about life, she did most of the talking, mostly about her kids and family, and claimed she was hitchhiking to Alaska, and for some insane reason that I can't remember. I had a joint that I decided to give her and let her smoke while we were driving. I'm not sure why, perhaps it was to make her quiet a bit. Eventually she asked if I wanted to try her weed, but kept mentioning how it tastes funny, which was a red flag, so I politely said no. Then she started getting weird, talking about homeless camps where people smoke meth. Then I actually got a good look at her and realized she was probably like a 40-something-year-old tweaker and not as old as I thought she was. Also, I think I saw an Adam's apple, and it could have been a dude, so... Anywho, she starts pointing out the rest stop signs or whatever, and we're like 100+ miles out, and was trying to convince me to go to one with her, and kept saying, I don't have any money, but some people will do stuff to you for a ride. At this point, I'm actually driving like a maniac in the middle of a pretty bad snowstorm at the time, in hopes that I'm more visible and noticeable to people if anything were to happen. I'm scared for my life, politely refusing all her advances and offers for drugs. Finally, we get to a town on the opposite side of the Rockies from Denver, and I pull into a gas station and say, okay, I gotta go back to Denver and get some sleep. I'm dropping you off here. And all she said was, you're a very smart young man. And I helped her unload the suitcase and left, thanking God that I was still breathing. If any of my actions are questioned, this was a time in my life where I was particularly lost and not in a good mental state at all. Definitely shouldn't have been roaming Colorado by myself, a smaller guy with no weapon aside from a knife. I am incredibly lucky. I was at the gas station and went up to the register to buy gas and some drinks as I was going on a small road trip. I got there and there's this large balding man with a ginger beard and the name tag Guy. I smiled at him and was polite, since I work customer service and try to be nice to everyone because you never know what kind of day a person may have had. Guy smiled at me and asked if we'd met before. I'd never seen him before in my life and made a joke saying that I just had one of those faces and laughed it off. But I had alarm bells ringing in my head because of his tone. I had a deep sinking feeling in my gut as he took his time checking me out. Guy kept trying to talk to me and said I looked great. He scratched his head and beard, and I could swore I saw some bloody dandruff or something come down onto the counter. I took my change and went to my car, filling it up as quickly as I could. I pulled out my phone with the intent to let others know my location and just to tell my friends and mum. That's when I felt hot breath on my neck, as someone body pressed me against my back. I spun around and there was Guy, and the most ungodly smell hit my nose as he looked down at me. I'm 5'6" and my best guess is that he was a 6 foot. He smiled, multiple of his teeth were missing, and he said it was rude for me to be talking about him behind my back. I laughed and apologized and went to quickly get the gas pump out the car. Before I could get my hand on it, Guy grabbed it for me and did it for me, smirking and saying that I shouldn't bother doing such manly things. He went on to explain that he finally knew where he knew me from. He explained that I was his sex slave in a past life, and he was my master, and he knew my frame anywhere. Bear in mind I'm 17 and had never met this man before in my life. I nodded and tried to laugh it off, saying, "Oh, really?" as I didn't want to anger him. The man didn't seem to be happy with that, as I tried to go around and get into my car. He opened the passenger door to get in. I was in full panic mode and had started my car and put the pedal to the metal with both driver doors swinging open. As I drove away, Guy had fallen to the ground and started to scream and curse. I pulled over after a few miles and shot both of them. So Guy at the gas station, please, let's not meet again. I was driving across the country with my mum and sister when I was 16 and my sister 20. It was late, but we were well rested and still alert. We were driving along an interstate and needed gas and a bathroom break, So we stopped at the only rest stop in 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on a road trip at the gas station, as well as a small grey car parked at the pump in front of us with 2 young men standing still outside of it. When we got there, everything felt wrong. We'd been on this road for days and seen many rest stops at night and had never been afraid until then. My mum and sister went inside and I stayed in the car. I heard the teenagers say they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work. They left in a hurry. I was watching the car in front of us, and the 2 men hadn't moved at all. They weren't talking, weren't on their phones, and were just standing as still as stone. My sister and mum came running back to the car, and when they got in, the 2 men slowly turned to look at us while not moving or pivoting the rest of their bodies. I swear to hell we saw the same thing. They had dark, empty eyes. We sped out of there and didn't stop until we were in the next city. The worst thing about the entire experience, we couldn't find the place on any map. We knew exactly which spot was on the interstate to look for and couldn't find it on Google Maps or any paper map we owned. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station on that stretch of road and only got confused looks. We travelled on that interstate since and have never seen the rest stop again. When I was a kid, my mum worked as a teacher, and she was very close to a co-worker of hers called Kathy, who had a son around my age. When my mum or her friend would head out for the night, the other would take care of us, and basically, it meant I spent half my time over their house, and my friend Marcus half the time at mine, which was perfect and fun for us. We lived in different cities, but since that kind of system had been going on pretty much since forever, I grew up knowing my friend's city almost as well as I knew my own. His mum was well aware of that, so that being said, whenever we were going on a walk in the area, she'd let us wander around because she knew we'd always find our way back. My mum was a bit more cautious and always kept an eye on us though, as she'd always walk behind us to make sure she was always able to see us. I just wish her friend would have done the same. One day when I was around 6 or 7, we were going on a walk with my friend Marcus and his mum Katty. It was a very sunny day, and I was wearing a dress with embroidered flowers, and I had my blonde long hair down. I often heard I was a pretty kid, even from strangers on the street, and beside making me and my parents somewhat uncomfortable, nothing bad ever happened. During that walk, Kathy was walking dead ahead of us, and I was chatting and fooling around with Marcus, when he suddenly remembered something urgent to tell his mum. He ran up to her and left me strolling behind for a few minutes. That time though, we were circling around a big campsite, and we walked by white vans and camping cars. One of those vans had its back doors open, and there was a man in his 40s smoking a cigarette and leaning onto the vehicle. His eyes locked with me, and then I saw Kathy and Marcus weren't paying much attention to me, as they were already a fair distance ahead. He then proceeds to pull me by the arm close, and I found my body touching his. I was so weirded out I didn't even say a word, although I knew Kathy would have heard me if I called for help. He leaned towards me and he was obviously much taller than I was, muttering something I didn't understand. He winked at me and kissed me on the lips and then pulled me to the open doors of his van. At this point, if he had pushed me just a little, I would have fallen into the truck. I was too scared to even lift a finger, and even though I didn't understand everything that was going on, I knew it wasn't okay. He puts his hands on the doors as to close the vehicle, and I felt my heart sink. At that exact moment, some other man jogged towards us in his 40s, waving hello to me and saying something along the lines of, "I lost sight of you for a bit. I was so scared." He had a very friendly look on his face and was staring at me with great insistence and a huge reassuring smile. And the van man awkwardly laughed and yanked me out of the way of the car, slamming the doors shut. I ran to Katty as I heard the van go off and just acted as if nothing had happened. To this day I never told that story to anyone, not Marcus nor Kathy, not to my mum, no one. I'm 22 years old. So to the friendly guy who obviously didn't lose sight of me or whatever, but probably saw everything and wanted to interfere, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I'm sure that guy would have abducted me. Who the hell feels comfortable enough to kiss a strange kid in public in broad daylight? But everyone thinks the same thing as I do, and I wish you hell. About 6 or 7 years ago, my family of 9 moved into this new house closer to town. I was around 14 to 15, just starting my freshman year of high school. We didn't know much about the neighborhood, except that it was right next to a nice big Catholic church. Like, nice. The church is so close that you can actually see it from the yard and walk to it in a couple of minutes from the house. So we thought it was a nice, quiet neighborhood. Well, one morning I'm getting ready with my siblings to go to school. Our neighbors we had at the time were a little weird. We didn't know much about them, but they hated that we had dogs that barked a lot, 2 white German shepherds that we had rescued a few years back. So there were a few times he had threatened to shoot them, which led to us giving them away because we were afraid of their safety and the police couldn't do anything on a threat alone. I had only seen the neighbor once or twice, and he was a rough-looking dude. I'm guessing he was in his late 40s, very skinny as if he did meth or something. I was the first one out the door that morning, to wait by the car that was in the driveway. I was standing about 3 feet from the road because I was walking around and waiting for everyone else. The only other person outside was my 12-year-old sister, who was behind the gate. As I was just walking back and forth at the end of the driveway, the neighbor's car came speeding down the road and started to slow down when he saw me. Keep in mind, I didn't know everything about this guy that I do now. I didn't know about the level of creepy he was. I just saw him as one of the neighbors. My parents didn't tell us about the reason why we had to give away our dogs at the time, and I was a very ignorant and clueless child. So he slows down, smiling at me when his car came to a stop, only a few feet from where I was standing. He then pulled out a bag, just like a plastic bag that looked like it had something in it. It also looked like it was bagged a few times over. He told me it was for my little brother, who liked to play basketball. We had a basketball hoop in our yard, and I asked what it was. He told me it was a basketball. Right away I got this incredibly sick feeling in my stomach, and at the time I didn't know why, but the feeling I got from this guy made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. He asked me to come get it so I could give it to my brother, and I was hesitant, because if it was just a basketball, why did he have so many bags around it? So I asked if he could just throw it over, and around this time my little sister that was outside with me had gone, so I told my mum that there was someone outside. When he saw my sister leave, he started to get out of his car. Before the man could say anything to my mum, she'd come out the front door and was standing at the porch, asking the neighbor what he was doing, and without saying anything he jumped back into his car and floored it down the street. I can't imagine what would have happened if my sister hadn't have told my mum, or even been outside to see what was happening. To this day, it still gives me chills. We never saw him again after that, and he moved away a few months later. Back in 2018, I was living in the suburbs of Paris and had been playing Pokemon Go since its release 2 years earlier. I used to go out at play at night, always with my best friend on voice call. It was like any other night, following my usual route. It was around 2 AM and I had already covered a good 2 kilometers. I found myself about 1 kilometer away from home, standing near a Pokestop, catching what I could while talking to my best friend, just like every night. It was a residential street with a few streetlights, but quite dark, as there was a field just behind it. After about 5 minutes, I noticed a man in his 30s on the opposite sidewalk, just a few meters away from me, holding head shears in his hand, and there were a pile of branches at his feet. I thought the man was just trimming the branches of the tree. However, when I described the scene to my friend, he told me to leave right away, as no one does gardening in the middle of the night. Despite my friend's warning, I was so focused on playing Pokemon that I wanted to capture all the ones in the area before leaving, so I stayed while keeping an eye on the man's actions. As I looked at the man, I realized he wasn't cutting any branches, he was only staring at me. He would occasionally move and hide behind a parked van nearby while spying on me through the windows. However, he knew very well that I could see him, and I began to feel scared. Despite my friend pleading for me to leave, I still hadn't caught all the Pokemon, so I hesitated to go. The man continued his strange behavior, crossing over to my side of the street and hiding behind some bushes while staring at me. Then he went back to his pile of branches and stared at me again. Finally, I'd had enough and decided to leave. I walked normally towards my home, trying not to show any fear. I had a straight path back home. My friend on the call asked me to check behind me in case the man was following me, and indeed he was still holding the head shears, about 10 meters behind. I then made a left turn instead of going straight, even though it made my route longer. I just wanted to be sure that he was following me and that it wasn't a coincidence. He continued to follow, so I picked up the pace, taking snaps just in case something happened. When I reached the end of the street, I was out of breath but safe, and there was no one behind me. I entered my home feeling relieved, when suddenly a white car pulled up right in front. It stopped, and the driver's window rolled down. It was the man with the pruning shears. Now he knew where I lived. I rushed inside, locked everything, and grabbed a kitchen knife, and waited until someone woke up so I could go to bed. There were no further incidents. No one believed me, so we checked the surveillance cameras at home, and unfortunately, I was right. When I was 12, I went to a summer camp/internship thing at an oceanography institute. I don't want to say which one, but I will say that the research for the institute is to learn about oceanography. The town nearby is a famous touristy beach town, so once a week the counsellors would drive us to the town and let us shop around for a few hours. They would not chaperone during these trips, but we had to be in groups of at least 6 for safety. In my group of friends there were 3 boys and 3 girls. Us girls wanted to buy some bras at the nearby lingerie store. The boys were fine with this, but didn't want to go to the store, so they waited out front. Apparently, 2 older guys walked up to the store while we were in there. Here's a rough script of what transpired. "Where are your parents?" "We're part of summer camp, we aren't with them." "Well, where are your counsellors?" "They're on the common." "Why are you standing outside a lingerie store?" "We're waiting for our friends." "So there's unaccompanied girls in there?" And before my friend could answer, the 2 creeps ran in the store. I get a frantic call from my friend telling us to exit out the back door because 2 creepy guys ran inside. We rushed out and they explained what happened. We went to our counsellors, who called everyone back to the common, and we ended the trip early. I don't know if they were intending to harm us or not, but it was definitely sketchy and made everyone feel very uncomfortable. First off, a little bit of backstory about my dad. The man has so much character to him. He is the most chilled out grandpa at this point, whose biggest offense are the likes of placing a box of dead kittens in the topic hat when the family plays charades at the Christmas Eve get-togethers. When I was a kid, he was a crazy person. He was an amazing father, honest to a fault, and had a character made of stone. He apologized when he felt he was wrong, and he would sit and cry with you when things were eating away at your self-esteem. However, as much as I owe him my mortality and compassion towards others, I also owe him my extremely demented and nothing-is-scared sense of humor. The man got more joy from life in tormenting his children than anything else. We lived on my grandmother's farm in rural Tennessee, and when the power would go out, which happened a lot in our area, he would dare me to run to the mailbox and then lock me outside at 10 o'clock at night when I was 10 years old. And he would laugh so hard and I could hear him over my screams while I banged on the door from the outside, pleading to be let back in. He was the type of dad who would wake you up in the morning by revving a chainsaw, changing the locks in the house to make you get ready for school at 2 a.m, and stand on the front porch in his tidy whities while you're getting on a bus in the morning and yelling, "I love you, I'm gonna miss you," in a voice that could only imply he was suffering from severe brain damage. In other words, he was always looking for a way to scare you, embarrass you, or make you have such a crazy, unexpected experience that you would guarantee to remember him forever. And it worked. I love that man. Now, That was needed for context, and this story takes place in my second to last year on my grandmother's farm. I was 17 and had been working a job in my small town stocking beer coolers and mopping floors at the local gas station. I was driving home from work in my little truck at about 10 p.m. As I pulled into the driveway, my headlights shone up the hill to my grandmother's house and panned down the hill to the edge of our single-wide mobile home. I stopped immediately, all 4 tires in the driveway pointing straight to the end of that stretch of gravel. I could see my dad, his old flatbed truck, and my stepmother's minivan were parked pointing to the left at the base of our trailer. He was standing behind them with his back to my headlights. Our chocolate Labrador Cassie sat at his feet, staring intently at him, paying no attention to the vehicle entering her territory, which was highly unlike her. I only stopped because it was so late and so unusual for my dad to be outside at this time. It was in the middle of the week, so he was usually passed out in his recliner wearing nothing but his underwear with the History Channel quietly rambling on about the Civil War. I slowly proceeded down the drive. Our drive was about half a football field in length, and as I drove down slowly towards the bottom of the drive, my dad began to walk, still with his back turned to me, and stepped behind the vehicle, the height of my stepmom's van fully concealing him. It took another 15 seconds from that point for me to reach the end of the drive and pulled my truck to the side of his flatbed, leaving me closest to the road. I grabbed my big gulp and got out of the truck. "Dad?" No response. "Dad?" Still nothing. Immediately I got a bit creeped out, but then I thought to myself nearly as quick, this dude's trying to scare me again. He must think I didn't see him. So I got down on my knees and peered under the vehicle. His left boot, unmistakable. Cassie's back leg and butt right beside him, tail tucked between her legs. I hollered out, "You did a crappy job of hiding, Dad. I can see your boot sticking out from behind the tire of the van." I watched as his left foot slowly slid to the right until it was concealed behind the tire with the other. Still no response. So I called out for the dog. "Cassie!" She turned and scurried between the vehicles to get to me, as though she was under heavy gunfire. She was whimpering when she got to me, and acting very strange, as if she was afraid. She was acting how I would imagine a dog would act if they were constantly beat on, and I had never seen her behave that way before. When she got to me, I placed my hand on her. You could almost hear her breathe a sigh of relief. She was sticking to my legs like glue, and as I was sitting down on one knee and a bit off balance, she nearly knocked me over. I pet her for a moment and tried to comfort her, but she seemed like she was afraid of something. With her tail tucked between her legs, she pushed herself in between my legs as I stood up. It was after seeing how timid and odd Cassie was acting that I decided that I may be misreading the situation and that I might need to get into the house. My dad surely was a prankster, but when he was caught, he was caught. He never made things drag out once he was caught. He would come out and say something like, "Guess you kids ain't as gullible as you used to be. I'm gonna have to start stepping it up a notch." Dad didn't drink much, never really got drunk at all, but I couldn't think of what the root of his odd behavior could possibly be, and it really started to weird me out. I made one last attempt at communication. "Dad, I know you're there. I saw you when I pulled into the driveway. The jig is up. What are you doing out here?" No response. I started the round in front of my truck, to round the vehicles and walk over to him. Cassie began to panic and whimper loudly, still glued to the inside of my ankles, crouched to the gravel with her head darting back and forth wildly, and I stopped in front of my truck. I stand there for another moment in silence, waiting for something, but not sure who, and then announce, "Yep, I'm heading in. See you in a bit, weirdo." I turn to walk to the front porch, unconsciously building speed as I hit the first step. Cassie drops back and doesn't follow me onto the porch, but seems to sort of stand guard at the foot of the steps. Keys in hand, I'm already searching for the deadbolt key. Panic is building in my chest, but I'm not sure why. I hurried to unlock the door and jumped into the house, swinging around and slamming the door behind me, locking the deadbolt all in one fluid motion. From behind me, I hear a voice yell, "What the hell?" I spin around, my big goat drops to the floor and explodes across the living room floor. There is my dad in his underwear, sitting up from a deep sleep in his recliner. I begin to hyperventilate and yell through gasps of air that, "There's a man in the driveway, hiding behind the van. I thought it was you. I was talking to him, Dad." I nearly collapsed on the floor. Within 15 seconds, my dad is running out of the back door of the house with a spotlight and a handgun, still wearing nothing but his underwear. He was outside for what felt like forever. When he came back, he was as pale as a sheet. He said someone was definitely out there, but you couldn't see them. He could hear them running, but when he pointed the spotlight in the direction of the footsteps, there was no one there. The crazy thing is, our trailer sat at the front of an 150-acre cornfield, and it was off-season. So everything was tilled down to dirt and there was nowhere for anyone to hide. It was a terrifying experience, and I know it's one that seems easy to explain. My brain really wants to tell me I had just foiled a car thief or something, or maybe even stopped a potential home invasion. But the thing is though, my dad has an unmistakable posture, an even more unmistakable walk. I knew they were his boots I saw under the van. I also knew that if he had somehow set all this up, I would have heard about it for years, because it would have been one of his favorite stories to share. How he scared me so bad when I was 17, and how funny it would have been. He does tell people about this from time to time, but he always ends with the same detail, that it wasn't until he was outside running around in his underwear with a handgun that he realized that Cassie had been sleeping on the floor next to his recliner when I ran into the door. So who the hell were they? And what did I witness? I was driving home on a storm day, and I see that a side road up to the local golf course is blocked up by flashing barricades, and I spy a Mercedes parked past the barricades with its hazards on. I stop and walk up to the car to see if they need help, as I'm an EMT. I shine my light in the back seat to see a man slumped over, apparently asleep. Thinking I've got a few drunks, I move up to the driver window and rap on the glass and shine my light in. The driver is sitting bolt upright, unmoving, staring straight ahead. My window rapping or light doesn't cause him to blink, flinch or move. I look over and the passenger is slumped forward onto the dash. This begins to creep me out. I call down to the sheriff's station and request a code 2, no light/siren units up to my location to help me check them out, as the doors were locked. While on the phone, I walk back to my truck to get my go bag. As I'm on the phone with dispatch, she asks me to get a license number for the car, just as a power company cherry picker comes rumbling down the closed road. I move to go around the truck to get the plate number, and the car is gone. I talked to the driver of the truck, and he said there was an 80-foot tree down across the road, and he didn't think it would be open for a day or so. So the question is, where the hell did the car go? Tree up one way, barricades on the other? It kept me a bit unsettled when stopping at hazards and accidents since then. Has anyone ever been lost in a place where they felt familiar? My friend and I tried to meet up at a cemetery to visit a friend. It was late at night, and I visited the cemetery for over 12 years. I was meeting a friend there to visit at night, and we got lost. I pulled into the north entrance of the cemetery and parked. As I waited for my friend, I got an eerie feeling and pulled out of the cemetery, through the south entrance, and drove a bit around the road. I was on the phone with her the entire time. She drove north towards the cemetery and I was driving south away from it. She got to the cemetery passing me and I still didn't see. I asked her to park and drive back. Both of us had our brights on and we saw no one. She said she was parked in the cemetery and didn't see me. We continued to drive up and down the road opposite to each other and never found one another. When we decided to meet at the church off the highway, we were on a back road. I pulled up to the church, and so does she. We honestly have no explanation for this. I work in IT in the hospice industry. and one of my workers, a CNA, shared a haunting story from our unit about a patient who passed away. She heard that the family were present as the patient's death was imminent, so she walked into the room. The room was crowded with people, and she had to navigate around them to tend to the patient. She noticed that everyone was dressed in church clothes, suit and dresses, and after finishing her task she left the room. 15 minutes later she returned and found the nurse there alone. Confused, she asked, "Where did everyone go? Where are the family members?" The nurse looked at her and replied, "That patient died in the last 10 minutes. The family is in the waiting area now." Curious, she went to the waiting area and saw only a few family members sitting there in regular clothes. She then checked the other rooms, thinking she might have mistakenly entered the wrong room earlier, but they were empty, with no family members nor patients. It dawned on her that she never really looked at the people in the rooms, never saw their faces clearly, because she's only about 5'2". The realization unsettled her. She couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps those she saw were former family members of the patient that were there to welcome her to the other side. I once worked at an assisted living facility that had been converted from an old hotel. The current dining hall used to be an indoor swimming pool, but it was filled in years before the facility opened. There are no traces of the swimming pool in that area anymore. A female resident with dementia would often complain to us about the noise of children playing and splashing in the pool. Another resident whose room was situated directly above the dining hall also frequently mentioned hearing kids' voices and the sound of water. Both were convinced they heard these noises despite the absence of a pool or any children. Additionally, this facility had its own eerie quirks. I often felt as if someone was walking right behind me, but whenever I turned around no one was there. It was a place full of mysterious and unsettling incidences. I used to work in a nursing home. The residents in certain rooms would complain about a man in their room at night, but hallucinations are common in the elderly, so it wasn't really noticed. But one night I was mopping the dining room, which had a huge window overlooking the garden. It was around 1 a.m, pitch dark outside and low lighting inside, when I had this horrible feeling of being watched. So I looked up, and reflected in the window was a man behind me wearing a brown suit and bowler hat, with the cruelest look on his face. He grinned and his mouth was too big. This happened in seconds, and when I turned around there was obviously no one there, but I'll never forget that look of evil on his face. I paid more attention to the residents after that, and they've all seen the man. It appears he just enjoys terrorizing these poor people. I worked as a caregiver in an assisted living facility before starting grad school. The facility was private, consisting of 3 different houses, each accommodating 6 residents and 2 staff members. At the beginning of my tenure, all the residents were women. One day while my coworker and I were in the kitchen preparing lunch, we suddenly heard a loud voice shouting, "Help me, help me." We quickly glanced back and immediately rushed to check on our respective residents. Finding no one in my part of the house, I returned to the kitchen. My coworker stood there wide-eyed with a bewildered expression. I asked her if she had heard the voice too, and she confirmed that she had, but there was no one on her side either. We both turned to look outside and saw all the residents were in the garden enjoying the roses. It was then we both realized the voice we had heard was distinctly male. Later I learnt that before I started working there, a male resident who was a World War II veteran with PTSD had lived in the facility. He often hallucinated and cried out for help before he passed away. Could it have been an echo of his ghost lingering in the assisted living facility?